Good morning, church. Good morning. Jim has chosen this morning the scripture reading from the book of Psalms, chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. That's Psalms chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. If you have it, I'll read. Give ear to my word, O Lord. Consider my meditation. Give heed to the voice of my cry, my King and my God. For to you I will pray. My voice you shall hear in the morning, O Lord. In the morning I will direct it to you, and I will look up. For you are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness, nor shall evil dwell with you. The boastful shall not stand in your sight. You hate all workers of iniquity. You shall destroy those who speak falsehoods. The Lord abhors the bloodthirsty and deceitful men. But as for me, I will come into your house in the multitude of your mercy. I fear of you. I will worship toward your holy temple.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you all for being here this morning. I feel honored with some friends that I've known for many years, and we really appreciate your attendance. If you look at the bulletin, the title of this lesson is What We Can Learn from David About Worship. Hopefully that has caused you to be thinking a little bit. In fact, some of you may be thinking, what is he off kilter? Because it should make you wonder, wait a minute, David lived in a totally different time frame. David lived under the law of the Old Testament, and we're living under the law of the New. What in the world am I drawing any conclusions about worship, our worship, from David in the first place? Well, we'll get into a little bit of a discussion about that, and you might be quoting to yourselves in your heads Colossians chapter 2. You can mark it down if you want, or go there if you quit. But I want you to come back to the book of Psalms later on. But in Colossians chapter 2, verses 13 and 14, it tells us that you being dead in your trespasses, this is Paul talking to the Colossian brethren now, and uncircumcision of your flesh he has made alive. You used to be in sin, but now you're made alive, together with him, being forgiven, having forgiven you of all your trespasses, having wiped out, remember this verse, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us. So he's talking about the Old Testament law, which was contrary to us. And he's taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. We get the picture of the Old Testament not being quite the same thing under us as it was for David. And truly that's the case. In the long run, however, I want you to also remember the other side of that picture. Paul again in Galatians chapter 3 verse 24, he says, therefore the law was our tutor, bringing us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. So there's a tension going on here. And remember again, and we talked about this on many occasions, that word tutor is probably an unfortunate translation in some of the translations. Because we get the impression that it's a school teacher. The word actually should have been translated rather school master rather than tutor. Because the Old Testament, surely it does some teaching, but it's really not teaching us to bring us to Christ. It's bringing, while I was sitting over there, I just thought of this picture. It's more like the school bus. that brings the children to school. It's really the school man. In fact, it is explained in those times, in the Roman times, the meaning of this word pedagogios, which gives us a picture in the English of pedagogy, the way teaching is being done. And the real meaning is it was a boy's guardian, a slave who had charge of the life and moral of boys in those days, that would make sure that he got to the school when he needed to. So it really would be kind of like the school bus that takes us to that location. So think of it in this way. The Old Testament is transportation for us, taking us to the Christ. So certainly the Old Testament does definitely have a reason for us to be studying it. And it's certainly important for us to be thinking about that. Now, it isn't so that we can learn what we must do as part and parcel of our worship. That we learn from the New Testament, and we have, as we know, our hermeneutic is that it's a command or approved example or necessary inference. That's how we find out specifically what we need to do while we're taking our time to worship God. But I still say we can learn a lot from David when it comes to our own mind, our own mindset, and the way we are about worshiping and praising God. So I want to take you on a little bit of a journey to see what it is that we can learn from David. First off, it was important for him to build a temple. We read from the Old Testament that he definitely did not think that it was right for them to be still using that old handmade tabernacle that really came into play during the wilderness wanderings. Remember, that was hundreds of years before that now. And so, turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 22, real briefly. 1 Chronicles chapter 22, verses 1 through 5. This is a description of what David felt about the temple that would eventually be built, that would house the worship that he was talking about in Psalms chapter 5. Remember, in Psalms chapter 5, it talked about, at the end, verse 7, but as for me, I will come into your house. So part of worship for David was being in his house. Watch what he thought of. 1 Chronicles chapter 22. Then David said, this is the house of the Lord God. Now he's not pointing to something because it wasn't built yet. Remember, David didn't have the opportunity to build it. And thus the altar of burnt offering for Israel. Now skip on down to verse 5, because he gives us a brief description of what he thinks that temple was going to look like. He gave an admonition to those that were taking care of and helping Solomon, his son, who was appointed by God to build that temple. David wasn't, but Solomon, his son, was. And so he's giving instruction now to those who would give instruction and watch after Solomon. In verse 5 he says, now David said, Solomon my son is young and inexperienced. And the house to be built for the Lord must be exceedingly magnificent. It must be famous and glorious throughout all the country. So the whole world is to know what kind of a building it was that he was thinking about. I will now make preparation for it. David's saying, I know my son's a good guy, a good boy, but I'm going to make preparation for this temple to be built. It's so important to him that it be magnificent, that it be famous, and that it be glorious, because that's the place that he was going to worship. Now, of course, he never got that chance. But that's the kind of thinking he did when he talked about to God. It must be in a place that's glorious. Now we realize in the New Testament it could be in any location. Because any place where 2 or 3 are gathered together, that can be the center of a worship. But think again about how our thoughts should be, according to what David has said. When you look up the word worship in the Bible, depending upon the translation that you're using, you can come up to as many as 112 different verses which talk about worship. That's throughout the entire Bible. 10, or actually more than 10% of those verses are found in Psalms. And isn't it interesting when we think about David and his closeness to the Psalms? And so I've chosen to talk to you this morning about some statements that David makes about worship. Now there's another lesson someplace down the line that talks about what David did about worship. But these are statements that he made about worship. And I believe we can learn a lot about worship and our attitude thereto from listening to what David had to say about worship. So turn back with me to Psalms chapter 5. This is the earliest, or the first of the Psalms that David mentions worship. And again, it was read to us already. I'll just pick out a few verses that are important. He says there, give ear to my words. Whenever, that was a fancy way of getting your attention. Give ear to my words. He could just say, listen up. That's what we would say today, probably. But he was saying, give ear to my words, O Lord. Now, does the Lord ever turn his ears off? No, of course not. Does he ever sleep? Remember Elijah, that thing with the prophets of Baal, and he wanted the priests of Baal to call to him. Maybe Baal's asleep. You need to wake him up. Remember that? I just finished reading that in my personal daily Bible readings. And I know that Elijah was just chuckling inside. He loved that. Oh, call down fire from your Baal, you priests of Baal. Maybe he's asleep, taking an afternoon nap. Maybe he's in a far country. Hey, can you just see him just smiling big time? God doesn't go to sleep. And Elijah knew that was the case. God is awake and alert at all times. But David wants to be sure that God's attention was given to him right then. Because it was important for him to let God know that he was paying attention to God at that time. And we can learn that in our worship. It's that important that we're spending some time today to worship God. I want God to know that I'm here. Well, it's not a thing of being not humble. It's a thing of being the fact that it is important to me. Skip over to Psalms 22. Psalm 22. Verse 27 through 29. I know sometimes I don't tell you what verse to go to. Psalms 22, verse 27 through 29. This is the second time that he mentions worship in a song. All the ends of the world shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you. He's talking then, and I know oftentimes we do have prayers right here in this building and in your own minds. We have prayers about others who are worshiping God today also. And depending upon the time zone, it might be right now that there are those in other places that are worshiping God. That shows the importance of the idea of worship. Don't you feel stronger when there's a fellowship of folks around you?
Amen.
Remember the old illustration, my father-in-law's illustration of the fireplace? I just had this last night. burning logs in the fire, they're blazing, and the coals are dropping off, and they're full of fire. And then you move some of the coals away. What happens? They go dim. You're no longer red. They start to cool off immediately when you're separated out of that community. So we have a community of believers throughout the world that are all worshiping today because it's the day for us to worship God. Then he goes on in verse 28, for the kingdom is the Lord's and he rules over the nations. Now there's a lot of nations. In fact, I wonder about this nation on many occasions. If this nation even today thinks that the Lord is ruling over us. I'm not sure that a majority of the people believe that anymore, but at one time they did. But sure, my little community right here believes that God is ruling over all of the nations. Go on to Psalms 29. There's one that I'm going to talk about at length, so I want to get going fast. But Psalm 29, verses 1 and 2, he mentions worship again. He says, give unto the Lord. What in the world could the Lord do? And yet David is saying, give unto the Lord. Well, he's giving because people need to understand that God has the authority. And he's calling on the powerful. We would call it today the rich and powerful. We would call it today the movers and shakers. The movers and shakers of this country need to know that God needs the glory. And that's what David was saying. Give unto the Lord glory and strength. Does he need us to give him anything? No, of course not. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. But we need to understand that he owns all those cattle. And we need to make others, if we possibly can, understand that that is the case. He has an interesting comment in the second verse. He says, give unto the Lord the glory due to his name. Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. When I ran across that, I was, what does that mean? Well, of course, we think of holiness as being pure and innocent. But Peter has something to say about it. Run mark again, just quickly over there, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 3 and 4. 1 Peter 3, 3 and 4. Peter says, do not let your adornment be merely outward. Something we can learn. Arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart with the incorruptible beauty. I used to be even more beautiful than I am today. You should see my baby pictures. Really, I got one when I was about 4 or 5 years old. I don't even remember when it was taken. I wouldn't know. What has happened? But this beauty is incorruptible. You can be 1,000 years old in this beauty and be just as handsome as you were in those days. I think that's a wonderful picture. Psalm 86 has another one. You might briefly go over there to Psalm 86. David mentions worship again. Psalm 86, verse 9 and 10. All nations, again, he wants to include, he was the ruler of a really, really powerful society in those days. David was the ruler over a pretty great country. And yet he knew that there were other nations around that didn't believe in the same God. In fact, a majority of those around him didn't believe in his God. And so he says, all nations whom you made shall come and worship before you. God's doing so many great things that people are going to hear about it and they're going to want to worship that name. And shall glorify your name. And I pray that could come about, both in our country and in the world today. So turn over to Psalm 138. We'll conclude with the entire Psalm 138. Again, he's talking about worship. What can we learn from what David believed about worship? I will praise you, he says, with my whole heart. Do we put our heart into it when we worship? We can learn from David that that's the way it ought to be. Then he goes on with a kind of an odd comment. Before the gods, I will sing praises to you. Now, is he saying that he believes in multitudes of gods? No. No, he was a monotheist. He believed in only one true God. But there were those around him that had other gods. And we in the world today, we see people that have other gods or believe that there are other gods. And they really sometimes even worship those other gods. And I'm not just talking about pagan worship. I'm talking about materialism and all the other things that go with it. But he says, before them, I'm going to still sing praises to you, Jehovah God. Verse 2. I will worship toward your holy temple. It hadn't even been built yet. But he knew that he had prepared for it. We can worship any place the God that we have. Now, it's good for us to be here together. It's really great for us to be here together. I'm glad we are. And again, I apologize for not rushing over and shaking hands with each one of you. That's what I'm inclined to do. As I mentioned before, I go and visit a dear sister who's in her 90s, and I don't want to carry anything to her that could possibly be carried over there. So I'll keep my social distance. But it's wonderful to be together. And he goes on to say, praise your name for your loving kindness and your truth, for you have magnified your word above all your name. Another kind of an odd thing. Does that mean that his word is higher than his name? No. It's a Hebrew problem, a Hebrew syntax problem. Because it may be that we're supposed to understand that I have magnified your word and above all magnified your name. Or it could have some other meanings that scholars have put on it. But whatever it is, magnification of God is important for our worship. Does he need to be any bigger? No. Do we need to think of him bigger? Yeah. Remember the old Phillips translation of the Bible, J.B. Phillips? I understand he had a quote there. It said, your God is too small. Think about that. Are you praying for little tiny things? Maybe your God's too small. David understood that we need to be magnifying our understanding of the God that we worship. Verse 3. In the day when I cried out, this is a theme of David's down through the Psalms. Every time you could study, it doesn't take very many Psalms before you realize that David is thanking God on many occasions, saying, oh, I realize what you have done. Now, he hasn't done the same things in our lives that he did in David's life. But I know he's done things in your life. He's done things that you should remember could only come from God. There are things in my life that I can say, how else could that possibly have turned out in that way. You answered me, he says. God has answered some of our prayers. Sometimes he said no, and we're upset by it. Really upset sometimes. But he's answered. I know that everyone that's here today can look back honestly on your life and say, God's answered those prayers. And it made me bold with strength in my soul. Sometimes we need to stand up for God. Sometimes we need to be strong. Skip on down to verse 1. All the kings of the earth shall praise you. I don't know when that's going to happen, but eventually. Will praise you, O Lord, when they hear the words of your mouth. Yes, they shall sing the ways of the Lord, for great is the glory of the Lord. Notice he brings song in there, and that's important. I think the singing today was exceptionally good. Thank you very much. Verse 6. Though the Lord is on high, yet, oh, look at this passage. You ever think, well, I'm kind of nothing. I'm one vote. There's millions of people vote. I'm just one. I'm just one citizen in a town of thousands. David says, though the Lord is on high, yet he regards the lowly. But the proud he knows from afar. So he still knows the proud, but it's at a distance because the pride of those people has its own power, but God notices the lowly. And finally, in verse 7 and 8. Does this verse work today? Some of you read it already. Some of you don't, you go ahead and skip on past me. That's okay. For though I walk in the midst of trouble, yikes. Anybody walking in the midst of trouble today? I don't need to go very deeply into that. He says, you revive me. Sometimes we need that. All the times I do. You will stretch out your hand against the wrath of my enemies. Now he's talking very personally there. He had some enemy. Remember, Saul was trying to kill him, threw spears at him. Glad Saul wasn't such a good aim. I mean, Saul was a mighty man of the army, head and shoulders above everybody else in the area. He was a big guy. How could he miss? But he did somehow, each time. He says, you revive me, you will stretch out your hand against the wrath of my enemies, and your right hand will save me. Now, he doesn't mean he'll be saved from death. Sometimes we think about it. Sometimes we pray about that, don't we? Maybe about our own, but many times it's about someone else. Sure enough, God says, no, that's not according to my plan. So we get discouraged. For years I wondered, how can you describe that to a little child? How can you tell that little girl in Bible class? And then she knows the real truth. But he's not talking about our physical lives. He's talking about the ultimate, where it really counts. And then in verse 8, and the Lord will perfect that which concerns me. What have I really worried about? When I come here and meet with you and say, I'm going to spend some time worshiping God, what am I really concerned about? Well, David says it right here. Your mercy, O Lord, your mercy That's what I want from God. Please, God, do not give me what I deserve. Please, God, give me your mercy. David proclaimed that it endures forever. God, you made me. Thought of that little song, He's Still Working on Me. Make me what I ought to be. Took just a week to make the moon and the stars, the sun and the earth, Jupiter and Mars. But He's still working on me. Don't forsake the work that you've done in me already, God. Give me mercy and not just give what I deserve. If you're thinking about that and there's sin in your life or you need to become a Christian, now's the time to say yes to the Lord. Let's say this.